Hello, my name is Brett Spence, and I thought for Remembrance Day I'll defend one of the most criticized and hated generals of the First World War, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Now let's talk about the history of the man. Douglas Haig was born on the 19th of June, 1861 in Edinburgh, Scotland. His father was the head of a successful wine distillery, Haig and Haig. He would attend Brasenose College in Oxford and pass his exams to join the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He would be commissioned as a lieutenant in the 7th Hussars in 1885 and would be sent to India in November 1886. He would gain a reputation as a disciplinarian and impressed his superiors for his administrative skills and analysis of training exercises. He would be promoted to captain on the 23rd of January 1891. He first saw action in the Madras War in 1898, where he would serve with Herbert Kitchener, better known as Lord Kitchener. He would join the Egyptian army, where he planned to train and command an Egyptian cavalry squadron, but Kitchener stopped him from taking command, and he would accompany the cavalry. Interestingly, Haig was one of few British officers that believed that the Egyptians could make good soldiers if they were properly trained and led. During his time in Sudan, Haig commented on the lack of machine guns and would make special trips to Enfield to study the Maxim gun, and throughout the campaign supported their usage. He would take part in the Battle of Akbara, where he would rescue a wounded Egyptian soldier under enemy fire, a heroic action that several officers believe should have got him a Victoria Cross. After the battle, Haig would criticize Kitchener for launching a frontal attack without hitting the Dervishers in the flank. During the Second Boer War, Haig would serve under the command of John French and would help French with his debts, which saw him boost his reputation and would be raised to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He would return to India to become Inspector General of Cavalry and in 1904 became the youngest Major General in the army. He would continue to support the usage of sword and lance in 20th century warfare, and in July 11th, 1905, he would marry Dorothy Maud Vivian, and the couple would have 4 children together. In August 1906, he would be appointed Director of Military Training at the War Office and with help from Richard Haldale, reformed the British Army. But Haig wanted a reserve of 900,000 men, but Haldale settled for a more realistic 300,000 men, and Haig's skills as administrator and organizing training and inspections were better employed in setting up expeditionary force of 120,000 men in 1907. He would be made Chief of Staff in India in 1909, and in March 1912 he would take command of Aldershot Command, where in the army maneuvers of that year he was decisively beaten by Sir James Grierson, despite having the odds in his favour due to Grierson's superior usage of aerial reconnaissance. When World War I broke out, Haig was one of the few people to predict that the war wouldn't be over by Christmas. Haig would be made commander of First Corps under the command of John French when the British Expeditionary Force headed for France. The first major action of the British was the Battle of Mons, where the British inflicted heavy losses on the advancing Germans. During the battle, Haig hesitated where he failed to send reinforcements to Second Corps, and when the British were retreating, Haig hesitated to cover the retreat of Second Corps and ordered his corps away from Second Corps as quickly as possible, leaving Second Corps to fight a desperate retreat, which they only survived when they had to leave their wounded behind. When First Corps arrived in the town of Lens, when panic set in, Haig rallied his men, moved from defensive line to defensive line, encouraging his men to fight bravely, but he did leave with his staff in the middle of the night. During the spring offensive of 1915, Haig favored a quick bombardment, but his peers favored a more methodical approach, but due to the shell crisis of 1915 meant that they can only do 35-minute bombardment, but due to the small front that the British were deployed at, the concentration of fire would be acceptable. During this time, Haig became greatly interested in aircraft, where he and Major Trenchard of the Royal Flying Corps organized aircraft to use for photo reconnaissance to map out the German lines and use aircraft for artillery spotting. After the Battle of Loos, Haig was made commander of the BDF on December 10th, and he began for an offensive to break the stalemate and win the war for the British at the Somme. On July 1st, 1916, the British suffered the bloodiest day in British military history despite the British bombarding the German lines. The usage of shrapnel shells meant that the bombardment did little to no damage to the German barbed wire. During the Battle of the Somme, on the 15th of September, the British Mark I tanks were used despite mixed results and many of them breaking down, but the remaining tanks broke through the German line before being stopped. Haig saw potential in the tank, and after the Battle of the Somme, he made an order for 1,000 tanks and would favor their continued production. On the 1st of January 1917, Haig was promoted to Field Marshal, and Haig started plans for another offensive to break the German lines at Passchendaele. After the Battle of Passchendaele, the new Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, started asserting his authority over his general staff, where he fired the First Sea Lord, Admiral John Jericho, and replaced him with Wolseley Wemyss. Over the objections of Haig and other officers, set up a inter-Allied Supreme War Council to better coordinate with the other Allied armies, and got his wish to send troops to Italy. After the Battle of Cambrai, Haig was criticized in the press and Parliament for the failed offensives of 1917, and this led to purges of Haig's staff. He had to divide British divisions from 12 to 9 battalions and had to cover more of the Western Front due to the French losses. So when the German spring offensive began in March 21st, 1918, which pushed the Allies back, and Haig did his best to stop the German advance. During the German spring offensive, the Maurice debate began, where David Lloyd George was accused of holding troops in the UK to make it harder for Haig to launch an offensive. David Lloyd George misled the House by saying that Haig's forces were stronger at the start of 1918 than the year earlier. In fact, the increase was caused by laborers, and Haig had few combat troops over the long front. Haig was not happy with Major General Sir Frederick Maurice in taking his concerns to the public, and upset that David Lloyd George got off the hook. After the Allied victories at the Second Battle of Marne and Amiens stopped the German offensive, and the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive, where Haig successfully broke through the German lines. After the war, Haig spent the rest of his life on the welfare of ex-servicemen. He would even refuse a vice-council to bargain better state financial aid for demobilized soldiers, which he got, and received £100,000 from both houses of Parliament as thanks. A little side note, during the First World War, Haig suffered a toothache, and after being a dentist, he decided to hire dentists into the British Army, which would lead to the Royal Dental Corps being formed in 1921. He would also set up the British Legion, which is a charity to provide financial, social, and emotional support to veterans, Haig Fund to provide financial assistance to ex-servicemen, Haig Homes to provide housing for veterans. Haig would die from a heart attack on the 29th of January 1928, and during his elaborate funeral, great crowds gathered in the streets to pay their respects to Field Marshal Haig. After his death, Haig received criticism over his leadership and the heavy casualties on the Western Front. His old enemy, David Lloyd George, wrote most critical of Haig in his memoirs. During the anti-war movement of the 1960s, Haig was portrayed as an inept commander who was willing to kill thousands of his men in pointless offensives, and the phrase "lions led by donkeys" became a common description of Haig's leadership during the war. This description of Haig is completely inaccurate, with Haig and other generals were writing new tactics of modern warfare, even though Haig believed cavalry still had a place in modern warfare. This idea isn't as crazy as it sounds. Check out Brandon Ev and the Great Wars videos on cavalry during World War I, links in the description. My thoughts on Field Marshal Haig: I'll say he was a decent commander and a great organizer of men. If you like this video, like and subscribe. See you next time.